uploaded to our YouTube channel, usually a couple of days after the webinars are done. So if you or anybody on your team would like to go back and review the information, then the recording will be available for you to do that. So as you guys are logging in, I see some of you have already started to check out the chat box feature, which is a lot of fun. So feel free to send your questions or just chat with each other inside the box. We're going to pause throughout the presentation today with a special emphasis on the end of our hour to be able to have some great conversation and discussion. Today's webinar is, it's the last of the series of this semester. And, our mission at Transforming Youth Recovery is to figure out a way to really build capacity for these collegiate recovery programs to get connected to resources with each other. And one of the ways that we wanted to do that this semester was, of course, with this Voices project, this webinar project. Just to review the goals quickly, we wanted to make sure that we're getting our collegiate recovery partners, our grantees, the community, the field in general, the best information out there as possible. And we've had a really good turnout this semester. I'm really looking forward to figuring out what we're going to do in the fall semester as far as topics go. So if you have questions or ideas, or if there was something we touched on this semester that you wish that we'd gone in more detail with, please feel free to send me an email. Also, if you have suggested speakers or guest lecturers, or if you would like to be a guest lecturer, please also shoot me an email and I will get you on that list. We are going to have 2 webinars over the summer. I just got approval for those. One is going to be on sustainability. We're going to have a development officer join us to kind of brainstorm what are some additional sources, either grants or private donors, or how do you build a really robust development plan for your collegiate recovery community or program. So that one's probably going to be in June. We're still waiting to get those dates kind of nailed in. And then the second one is going to be on research. I've had several conversations with a lot of our grantees this semester about what are the outcomes that we should be measuring. And you may hear a little bit today on what North Carolina has decided to use. But we really want to make sure that you guys are getting the most up-to-date information as far as research and outcomes go. So that is probably going to take place in July after the big conference that's taking place in Houston. The Association of Recovery and Higher Education is having their 9th conference. I can't believe it's the 9th one. And that's in July. I think it's July 9th through the 12th. And if you need more information, then please just let us know. Okay, so today's webinar entitled Collegiate Recovery Collaboration with State Offices. This idea came about through several conversations that I had over the past couple of years, actually. So I had the opportunity to be the executive director for the Association of Recovery Schools. And part of that position allowed me to go to DC quite a lot. And I got to meet with people like Tom Coder, Tom Hill, and some of these really kind of established recovery advocate people that really sort of created what we do today in the recovery advocacy world. And I had no idea that I didn't know so little. I learned so much from those guys about the various levels that we have to navigate in the advocacy world. And one of the most important kind of nexus of these conversations that's happening is at the state level. There's an office that hopefully our presenters will go over a little bit more in detail because I'm still learning as well. The single state agency in your state offices is critical. And things called block grants and some of the federal funding that's coming out. I think we need to do a better job, quite frankly, within the collegiate recovery world and recovery high school world of getting that information out so that everybody can learn how to be an advocate in our states. I also have had several conversations with some of our national leadership in various foundations, in nonprofits, and advocacy organizations, and none of them are really advocating for collegiate recovery on a daily basis. Some of them may throw it in as kind of like potatoes to their steak or green beans to their fried chicken. But we really want to impress upon people that almost 260 universities and community colleges across the country are doing this. And so we really need to come together as a community and learn how to advocate at every single level. So one of the states that I'm most familiar with this type of collaboration that's doing some really cool innovative work is North Carolina. So I called up my friend Chris Campau, who is in North Carolina, and I asked him, kind of ran the idea by him, and we both immediately said, we've got to get Jessica Herrmann. So here we are today. And I'm just quickly going to introduce them, and then I'm going to turn it over to them and you guys for this discussion today. So Chris graduated from North Carolina State University with a bachelor's degree in social work. He currently works for the Addiction Professionals of North Carolina as the Collegiate Recovery Program Coordinator. He also is the liaison between, and there's a whole string of letters here, which of course is the world of the state, North Carolina's Division of Mental Health Substance Abuse Services, I think I said that right, and the University of North Carolina General Administration, and all schools within the collegiate recovery community. So I like to think of Chris as like a train conductor. So he basically works between all of these different offices and these systems to make sure that collegiate recovery is getting the most information possible both ways. Chris is also an avid fisherman, and he enjoys making really hilarious memes of his baby daughter, which hopefully he will touch on as well too. He's a great guy. We also have Jessica Herrmann, who is the Mental Health Program Manager with the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. She began her career in the field of mental health and substance use disorder prevention, treatment, and recovery 24 years ago. Jessica holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and a master's degree in human resource development. She has enjoyed facilitating training events for over 16 years and has been a mental health first aid trainer since 2015. She has experience working directly with individuals and their families with lived experience, and has worked on a macro level to develop policy and enhance best practices in an effort to improve quality systems and operations throughout the state of North Carolina. Another interesting fun fact about Jessica is she's a beekeeper, which I find fascinating. So not only does she share her amazing energy with us in the advocacy world, she's also a really great mom, and I'm honored to have both of you speak today. So I am now going to turn it over to Chris and Jessica. I think you guys may be on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Hi, everyone. How are you? Thank you for joining us. Chris, you want to say hello?
Yes. Hello, everybody.
All right. Well, great. Thank you for spending a little bit of time with us. We're not going to take too much time, but wanted to share some information. I was fortunate enough to work with Kristen when she was here as the Director of Recovery Communities of North Carolina. She did a wonderful job. We wish she had stayed, but she moved on to some awesome, better things, including having a baby. So congratulations, Kristen. And I'm glad you're still working in this field because we need you. So thank you. Let me go ahead and start by saying that we have in North Carolina, well, let me start by saying collaboration and advocacy, when you're talking about single state agencies, the reason Kristen brought that up as being important is that they are the one person identified in every state who is eligible to apply for the block grants. So they're in the slide, which if you go to the next slide, you'll see a hyperlink to, oh, I'm sorry, they're a little out of order. If you go to the next slide, Kristen. So this single state authority, sorry, that was my bad. The single state authority link here will tell you who in your state is the person to contact and how to contact them. It is a little bit out of date. I think it's dated 2016, but you should still be able to reach that person. The reason that is important is they have the authority and decision-making ability around writing the block grants. And the Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Block Grant is where we get the majority of our funding that goes to recovery efforts in our state, at least in our state in North Carolina. So why don't we go back to the first slide, Kristen, if you wouldn't mind, where I'll talk a little bit about North Carolina's story. So in North Carolina, we started, I would be remiss to not mention our biggest advocate in Flo Stein. She worked at the national level for many, many years with NASDAD, and she's been a huge advocate both in her professional career and as a personal advocate for recovery. She started working on recovery-oriented systems of care concepts and efforts in 2000. So back in 2000, she started learning about it. She worked with some national leaders, and around the year 2006, we started educating treatment providers as well as other stakeholders in recovery-oriented systems of care and concepts. We began training them, bringing national experts here, and trying to integrate the recovery-oriented systems of care concepts, at least, into the work that they were doing. We started recovery messaging training around 2013, and connecting that with showings of the Anonymous People, which eventually became showings of Generation Found. We also had a lot of rallies around the state in North Carolina. So the rallies for recovery were a big impetus in trying to educate political leaders as well as folks who are just celebrating recovery, trying to educate people celebrating recovery who may not understand how to tell their story in a way that really conveys the message and doesn't get lost due to stigma. And then we started integrating money across the state for flexible spending in what we call cross-area service programs, where local LME MCOs, which are basically like a public management company, would integrate into their contracts some recovery concepts. And lastly, the state supported and encouraged and needed a recovery community organization to emerge, which ended up being Recovery Communities of North Carolina. And why we need that, and what I want to really impress upon all of you, is that the work we do at the state has to be driven from the need in the community and at the state level. So we shouldn't be the ones completely driving what goes into the block grant and what initiatives we try to fund and grant funds to. And so you have a voice is really what I'm trying to say. We need to hear you, and we need your involvement. Let's see if I missed anything else. So we also continue to grow recovery community centers, which if you aren't familiar with recovery community centers, they're more like, if you want to think of a center for people who are trying to find recovery, where they have a safe place to go, have a community, connect with others. You want to, if there's a need for job searching, there's some resources there. If you want a meeting, there's a place for that there. But if you're not into meetings, that's okay too. You can have fun and really just get together and watch movies or what have you. So, and lastly, we fund 6 public universities to have collegiate recovery programs in our state. The reason that Chris is going to go a little bit more in detail about this, but we fund 6 at this time, and we're moving to increase that number by 2, Chris, right? 2? And so, but we also recognize the need at the the community college level as well. So if you move to the next slide, and that's my son in that picture, by the way. If you move, actually one prior, Kristen, because I didn't really finish that one. Okay, so I just want to mention that please try to feel comfortable reaching out to people at the state level. We are public servants, and we are here to try to help and convey any messages to us that you feel that need to be heard. Try to build relationships, and Chris will go into this a little bit more too. Ask to be on listservs that include feedback for the Substance Abuse Prevention Treatment Block Grant. Every state agency posts that and needs your feedback, and has to post it for a period of time to get feedback. So please do that. Attend listening sessions when they're held, training events, that type of thing, and introduce yourself and share your interests. You also want to think about where your goals align with what the state is doing and how you can become partners. We need you as much as you might need us for the funding piece. So we need you to give us feedback and to help drive what those programs might look like. Okay, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So the way this just works is that oftentimes there's a federal award. There's a notification called an FOA, and that notice is publicized on the web, on particularly the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration website. And that's where the block grants are posted. And if you're ever interested in looking that up, just Google SAMHSA Substance Abuse Prevention Treatment Block Grant. And yes, it's still called substance abuse. So I'm sorry. We're trying to change the language all over, and we're not effective everywhere. So once that's posted, the single state authority actually writes for the grant, and then once we get it, we get a notice of award, and those have parameters on how the funds can be spent and what the restrictions look like. And there are always restrictions when you're talking about federal dollars. An example of a restriction is you can have incentives for a program, but you can't necessarily buy gift cards unless you're talking about the Access to Recovery grant, which has a stipulation saying you can buy gift cards. But that's just knowing the ins and outs of those grants can be important. Then once we have the notice of award, we bid out that. We bid out the different programs that we might want to fund. And if the money doesn't go, for what money doesn't go to our LME MCOs, which is the public service level, meaning the HMO type, for those who aren't as familiar, it's like an HMO, public HMO. But we also do contracts, direct contracts, of which Chris works. Chris works for the Addiction Professionals of North Carolina. We also have a contract with Recovery Communities of North Carolina so that they have some operational funds. And we also have money in there for the Recovery Community Center and an expansion of that. So we have grants, we have almost like mini grants that we give to expand recovery community centers in our state. But with that, and I'll give an example, the UNC General Administration gets money from us to go to the 6 schools, and they're sort of a pass-through. And those 6 schools spend the money a little bit differently from each other to operate their collegiate recovery programs. Then we have to manage and oversee those dollars. And we typically operate in our state on the state fiscal year, which is July 1 to June 30th of each year, even though the federal fiscal year is different. The federal fiscal year is October 1 through September 30th. So there's just some information on the process. Does anyone have any questions? Let's see if anyone has any questions. Okay. And I think we're going to be moving to Chris's slide next. So you can move off. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. I just wanted to say really quick that this is some really heavy information, everybody, that we're going over. So I'm pretty sure if you're like me, we need to digest, and we'll just keep the questions kind of written down, and then we'll probably go over it at the end of the hour. But I definitely have a few follow-up questions. We'll go ahead and let Chris go, though.
Sounds good. Thanks. And I'll mute myself.
Okay, thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Jessica, and thank you, Kristen, for asking us to be a part of this. So Jessica had mentioned that that the 6 universities who received funding, and we'll talk about those 6 universities here in a moment, but the catalyst for that funding came in 2013 from a meeting with Governor McCrory and then Speaker of the House, now Senator Tillis. And that meeting, and we'll talk about how that meeting was set up as well. There's a lot of moving parts with this. But I just wanted to let you know that the catalyst for all of this in this meeting was put together by a lot of people who really care about putting recovery supports on college campuses. To the best of my knowledge, and I haven't been able to find any different, North Carolina was the first state to start using these sort of public funds, these prevention block grant funds, for collegiate recovery. And the growth and the recognition and acknowledgement of collegiate recovery in North Carolina was bolstered tremendously by this effort. So only 6 out of our 17 public universities were funded. And at first there was, I personally was kind of upset by that. But what we quickly realized is that the tide sort of rose for everybody. Everybody got recognition as collegiate recovery in North Carolina. And we had some other schools who didn't receive funding do some very innovative things to start and sustain collegiate recovery. Would you like to go to the next slide, Kristen? Cool. So here are the 6 universities that initially received funding. ECU, East Carolina University. I know Jarmichael Harris is on this webinar right now. University of North Carolina, Greensboro, University of North Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina A&T State University, University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and University of North Carolina, Charlotte. And what's really interesting about this is that a handful of these schools, Chapel Hill, Charlotte, and Wilmington, already had collegiate recovery efforts, and the money that came from the state really just sort of helped to secure their infrastructure that was already in place. ECU, Greensboro, and A&T really didn't have any collegiate recovery efforts in campus. And what's been really interesting is we really haven't seen a whole lot of difference in the success, quote unquote, success of these programs, regardless of whether or not they had pre-existing infrastructure before the money or not. And as you can see at the bottom, all of these sources are from the Substance Abuse Prevention and Treatment Block Grant. So if you'd like to go to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about what we're doing now. So there's a new round of funding. We have 3 schools that are engaged in a planning grant, and those are Appalachian State University, which is a very rural campus in North Carolina, North Carolina Central University, which is a historically Black college and university, and North Carolina State University, which is a very large urban campus. And why I love these 3 universities as part of this planning grant was we're getting a great cross-section of North Carolina. We are understanding the needs of our rural campuses versus the needs of our urban campuses. North Carolina A&T State University is also a historically Black college and university and was one of the first funded universities. So we're also really excited to add North Carolina Central University, which is also an urban campus in Durham, but also is a historically Black college and university. And that's exciting because we, as people in collegiate recovery, as professionals in the field, really need to do a better job with outreach and diversity. And what's been really cool about the 3 planning schools is it's given us a real opportunity to capture the data as these schools are receiving money, as these schools are starting to get ramped up for collegiate recovery. So we, with the UNC General Administration, which is the UNC System Office, myself and Dr. Lynch have put together a qualitative as well as quantitative data for funding and advocacy, or for capturing the metrics from each school. And what we hope to have is the qualitative and quantitative data for funding and advocacy. We know that people's recovery stories are important. We know that individuals telling their story of getting into a university, graduating from that university, and then being able to give back are always great stories. What we really want to do is just to capture the numbers. So every person that we encounter, regardless of their reasoning for being involved in collegiate recovery, if they're about the human story, we've got plenty of stories. But if they're only about the numbers and the financial piece, we will also have those numbers as well. And I love, somebody had posted it earlier, that they talking about a standard for capturing these numbers across the country. And I also think that's super important. And then so using all of our system-wide resources to track data, using UNCGA, UNC General Administration, I apologize, and their offices, as well as using some of the resources we have from the state, from the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services. Can you go to the next slide, please, Kristen? So, at the very bottom of this slide, you will see something called constituent relations, and this is going to go back to that first meeting we had with the governor. So that first meeting with the governor was set up by Betty Doster at UNC Charlotte, and her title is this Special Assistant to the Chancellor for Constituent Relations. Not entirely sure how she got involved with collegiate recovery at UNC Charlotte, but she did, and we are grateful. And she was able to set up that meeting. Her job at the university is to be in touch with the General Assembly, with the legislature, with the governor's office, and all of these individuals. So her role in collegiate recovery was to bring that message to policymakers and then the lawmakers. And so you'll see some of the other examples of those titles on North Carolina campuses, our Director of External Affairs and Community Relations, Director of State Relations and Communications. So that's how that initial meeting and that initial funding got set up. Now, my role as a liaison between UNC General Administration, between the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services, the campuses, really came from my understanding the importance of having a point person that everybody could sort of reach out to no matter what their need around collegiate recovery was. And this is where it gets really tricky, because I would love to draw you a roadmap for how I got from an undergraduate student to the role I'm in. And as I was talking about it with Kristen and Jessica, and as we were thinking about it, one of the advantages I really had, and that I think that this is where it could become a replication model or to be replicated, is I was in social work at NC State, and my professors allowed me to go to anything that they deemed had value outside of my regular academic learning. So I was going to literally every meeting, every conference, every summit that I could possibly get into. And it was at these events that I met Jessica Herrmann, where I met Sarah Potter, who's our prevention person, Flo Stein, the individuals who are really making these decisions and how to really foster those relationships. And so, and even on campus, making some of those connections, some of those partnerships, especially with social work, who is heavily involved in policy, as well as public health departments on campus, who are also doing a lot of this policy work, getting around some of the researchers who are tracking the data. I unfortunately had to miss a research summit yesterday in Durham due to a family emergency, but there was a great summit yesterday on opioid research coming out of universities. So making those connections, being up to date on the trends, being able to speak to not just at the director level, but higher ed, chancellors, vice chancellors, deans, about the cost-saving measures of collegiate recovery has all been very, very important to this role. And, you know, trying to figure out a really good way to say this, sort of just staying in your lane, and when you're asked to do something by the state, do it to the best of your ability. I got in this field very quickly, and many of you may remember and know Jason Callis from University of Georgia, and he became known as the guy that roomed with the really angry guy at the Texas Tech ARHE conference years and years ago. And for a while, that's all my advocacy was just, you know, unbridled sort of frustration with systems. And Jessica Herrmann and a group of other great allies really helped me hone in my advocacy efforts. So learning how to work within these systems is super important. It's kind of easy to be an outsider yelling at the system. I think it's even more difficult to be within the system and playing by the rules and being able to enact change that way. So you want to go to the next slide, Kristen? So now we're going to talk about some of the lessons learned, and I'm sort of losing my voice. So Jessica, if you want to kick off some of the lessons we've learned.
Sure. You know, one of the things I'll say when we first, and folks can hear me, right, Kristen? One of the things I'll say when we first got started was there was a task force. The governor at the time, Governor McCrory, had called a task force on mental health and substance use, really to try to bring stakeholders to the table and identify gaps and needs. And one of the needs that was identified was around funding collegiate recovery programs. So essentially within about a 6-month period of time, maybe, I guess not quite 6 months, maybe closer to a year, but in a relatively short period of time, we went from 0 funding of collegiate recovery programs to having 6 schools funded. And Chris had mentioned earlier, some of those schools, about half of those schools had already engaged in either a plan for a collegiate recovery program or were already doing it without our money. And so those schools were at least familiar with what collegiate recovery programs look like, what they were, and then a few of the schools were not. And I think that in the end, it has worked out that, you know, all of the schools have really risen to the occasion and done wonderfully. But what I might have considered as an option, as a lesson learned, would have been to we didn't have the option at the time, but it would be nice to at least maybe have an application process for folks who were interested in this type of programming and in this type of money, to be able to apply for that and show their interest. And that also gains buy-in. The way it occurred in North Carolina was it was just stated, these are the schools, and the state found out about it kind of at the same time that the governor announced it, and it was in the paper, and boom, everyone's got money, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like I said, I mean, ECU is a prime example for, you know, stepping up and really doing a wonderful job with their collegiate recovery program. But I think that it can sometimes work better to have a little bit of planning and a little bit of buy-in and interest shown from the schools and the applicants. That's one lesson I would say. Chris, do you have some more?
You're muted, Chris. I think you're on mute.
Yep, I was on mute. I apologize. I also think that one of the really important lessons that we learned in North Carolina, and I think a lot of other schools and states are starting to pick up on this, is collegiate recovery does not fit in a box. To say this is collegiate recovery, this is what it is, this is what it should look like, this is what it will look like, and we in that sort of blanket standard in North Carolina caused some infighting. Where school X would say, well, they're not doing it right because they're not doing it exactly this way. And so with the initial funding for the schools, they all came at it so differently. And like Jessica said, it's all actually worked out, strangely enough. But there were some real early on learning curves where individuals had to sort of change the way they thought about not just recovery, but potentially about how they fit into recovery. We have a lot of recovery allies attached to our collegiate recovery in North Carolina, which we love. Figuring out a role for them, figuring out, this is a tricky one. If you are being funded by public dollars, and you attend an advocacy day, what am I allowed to say? What am I not allowed to say? If you are using those state-funded dollars to travel to the legislature, being very careful about what is lobbying versus what is advocacy. So a lot of those lessons learned, and really having to educate a lot of our coordinators on what they can and can't do. One of the most interesting ones that we just found out is that individuals funded by the Prevention Block Grant, and Jessica, I might screw this up, so correct me. Individuals funded by the Prevention Block Grant can't do fundraising in our state. So one of our sustainability measures was asking these coordinators to be fundraisers, and then we had to walk that back because we found out that they couldn't legally do fundraising if they were being paid by this grant. So not just the sort of recovery aspect and not just having to learn your own higher ed bureaucracy, but going through the state budget manual and figuring out what you can and you can't do with state dollars. And it's more than just we can't buy pre-prepared or prepared food for a meeting. And we found out that it was much bigger than just some of those, you know, really blanket items.
And I'd like to add to that, Chris, that fundraising isn't completely unallowable, but if say Chris is 100% paid for through the block grant, he can't do that within his 40-hour work week. He could do it on the weekend. He could do it outside of that, but he can't do it while he's being paid by the block grant with block grant funds. Now, if he is, 20% on our contract and 80% on a non-block grant funded contract, then he can do that in the 80% part of his job, in the other part of his job. So there's just some logistics that way. And the other lesson, I just add one more lesson, and that is that I think not to underestimate how parents can advocate, can be great messengers for collegiate recovery. There are lots of parents, even parents where there is no addiction in their family, who are interested in having programming at the school or university that is social but without drug and alcohol use. And so that's something to really think about as well in the advocacy piece. In addition to that, looking at the retention rates, there's some great data around the performance of students who are engaged in collegiate recovery programs, how they perform in school, how they stay in school, better than folks who are not engaged in those programs. So just using the data that's out there too.
Thank you, guys. So this is Kristen, and while I wait for some questions in the chat box, I was going to go ahead and do a follow-up question that I've been dying to ask since I knew we were going to do this topic. So one of the kind of the lessons learned in the national advocacy work that I got to do, and then the awesome opportunity I had in North Carolina, one of the lessons that I learned was how stigma has infiltrated at every single level. And I think one of the areas that we don't really talk about as a community is how stigma has played a role in funding sources. We've had several conversations at the SAMHSA Recovery Month Planning Partners meeting about contracts and about contractors and who has been able to get funding and the contracts directly from SAMHSA or directly from the states. And usually, with the exception of some states, North Carolina being one of them, usually the funding or the contracts go to almost like a middle party, a middle kind of neutral organization that isn't run by recovery people, that's not run by peers. And the optics of that seem to be that we have some work to do around stigma. And I wonder if that is something that you guys have identified, that you have overcome in North Carolina, that you, for lack of a better phrase, trust those of us that are living in long-term recovery with your money. I think that, this is something that we're going to have to talk about eventually within the higher education institutions as well. I think a major reason why our programs are not getting funding is because of the stigma. 100% we hear, oh, we just don't have the money, there's nothing there. And, old mentor of mine, Kitty Harris, used to say, well, how much do you pay for a golf team? So I wonder how much this stigma piece is playing into the contracts, into the direct funding from the universities, all the way down. Do you guys want to tackle that one?
Chris, do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So I will say that there is a middle party in our collegiate recovery programming through the University of North Carolina General Administration, but it was really just for the ease of use. So for example, we have a very skeleton crew at the Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services, and to be able to have 6 to 9 extra contracts and not enough staff to manage that, that's really the reason. And the reason I can say that is that we actually have other contracts that are direct contracts that go to people who have lived experience, both on the substance use side and the mental health side. And so we don't have an issue with stigma on that end as far as giving money out to people and expecting them to manage the money and expecting them to learn the very complicated federal restrictions and requirements and uniform guidance and understanding an audit and understanding all of that, because we've done it for years, and we don't have an issue with that. And I would say that one of the reasons that we don't is that we partner with people who have lived experience, their families and allies, and we need those folks. We need the folks. We are those folks. Many of us are those folks, and many of us also need those folks. So I don't think we see a discrepancy in that front, on that end, to your question, Kristen. But where collegiate recovery is concerned, no, we don't have direct contracts with the universities as they are right now. We go through a middle party for that. Chris, did you want to add?
Yeah, and I'm sure for those individuals who are working on a university campus, or even within a community college, the messages that we receive from higher ed administration are highly stigmatized. I'm not going to name the school, but we recently stumbled upon an admissions letter, a denial of admissions letter, that specifically said we do not take individuals with a substance abuse history, and they use the term substance abuse. Without even knowing how many students they already had in recovery on their campus. So we are still really fighting stigma on campuses, and this is going to sound really harsh too, but if you are engaged in collegiate recovery work, what you know traditionally is that it's very lonely. You're usually a one-person operation. You can find some strategic partners, some strategic allies, and you usually have a lot of buy-in up to the director level. But a lot of collegiate recovery folks, if you don't have funding, are in dual roles where they're a clinician and then they're also doing the collegiate recovery stuff. And so you're splitting your time, or you're working a 40-hour-a-week job and then another 20 hours a week potentially for collegiate recovery. And, you'll see that the data backs up that supporting students in recovery is not only cost effective, but the human cost of it is so important that, for myself, as a graduate who became employed and was able to give back to the community, able to give back not just to the community, but to my school, there's the human cost as well as, the financial piece. But some of the messages we get from the higher ed administration is like, oh, well, that's a really cute program. We're really glad you're doing it. But please don't be too loud about it, and please stay over here in your little niche world. Where in reality, we know that we're not talking about just students in recovery. We're talking about somewhere to 50, 60, 70% of other students who've been affected by a level of addiction could be receiving support from these type of programs as well, that are allies, and that are those that have been affected are just as important. And as we reach commencement time right now, this first week of May, I'm always really drawn to the individuals who have been able to graduate, who lived with somebody with addiction as a roommate or a suite mate, or had a parent back home that was really struggling, or a sibling that was really struggling, and that they managed to really grasp the importance of their education and get through all of the little crises that living with somebody with a substance use disorder has. And I'm so equally as proud of those individuals as I am those that are in recovery themselves. And we have so many of them on our campus. So collegiate recovery as an advocacy movement shouldn't just be us and our students in recovery and the one-person teams that are sometimes our staff, but should include all of our campus partners and all of our campus students who have been affected by substance use disorder.
Thank you, Chris. You're absolutely right. And I think that this conversation hopefully is going to roll into more conversations in July in Houston that AREG has been having as well, these critical conversations. Just to kind of, before we get into any questions or comments in the chat box, do you guys have any recommendations on what types of materials should our collegiate recovery programs be generating for state offices, for those administrators? What would be interesting from your perspective, Jessica, as far as, if you had something come across your desk, what would make you stop and say, oh, you know what, this might be a good fit for this subcontract or this project or this event? What would make you kind of pause, and as you've never heard of collegiate recovery before, and kind of what do you think would get your attention?
I would say that really a focus on multiple pathways to recovery within the Collegiate Recovery Program, a focus on health and wellness outreach into the community. So a program that's kind of already developed their own collaborations with other partners is always a good thing, because it means that they're being innovative, and no one can do this kind of work alone. So, and often the funds from the state and federal government are limited. So I like also, for example, there was a UNC Chapel Hill, before they were funded, had a strategic plan that they had put together, and they outlined how much it would cost for the Collegiate Recovery program, as well as they integrated a sober living space and housing. So all of those, kind of looking at a spectrum, is always a nice thing. Collecting data, how many of the students who utilize the program identify in a particular way, either identify as being in recovery or trying to get into recovery, or even how many stay in school. And I think one of the other issues that Chris has brought up before is that when folks leave college, so we're in a kind of a bubble when you're in the recovery program, what kind of follow-up happens after they leave the university, or what do they plan to do, and how do they plan to do that? Because as we know, there needs to be a longer-term connection for success to be the best. So or even how do they connect them with someone else who can continue that sort of engagement? So those are things that would be interesting to me.
Chris, do you have anything to add?
No, I think she pretty much nailed it.
Okay, good. All right, so I'll take questions from our callers. Anybody have any questions or comments?
There are some questions in the chat box.
Okay, let's see. Looks like Marbeth commented on the stigma in the CRP with 12-step versus MAT. Yeah, Chris, do you want to talk about what you're seeing as far as how you guys are dealing with that in North Carolina?
Yeah, yes. And actually that raises a really good point too, is that, currently in North Carolina, our Department of Public Health and all of these other state agencies have, excuse me, y'all, have recognized medication-assisted recovery, medication-assisted treatment as the gold standard for opioid treatment. And so, making sure that your collegiate recovery aligns with the work of your state agency. It seems it would be not in your best interest to go ahead and start fighting with a funding source about whether or not medication-assisted recovery versus abstinence should be a piece of your collegiate recovery. You always want to align yourself with the mission of your funding source, be that the state agency or be that the university itself. And so we do see a lot of stigma around other pathways, especially medication-assisted recovery in collegiate recovery, and it's not a black or white issue. There's a lot of nuances to it. We need to really look at SAMHSA's definition of recovery. Are you striving to live, your best life? Are you moving towards health and wellness? So that's sort of where, we stand in North Carolina on medication-assisted recovery. And Marbeth's institution out there in Nash County is doing great work around including those individuals.
Great, thanks, Chris. Are you aware of any efforts at your state level within the legislation to change legislation specifically to include collegiate recovery? I know that New Jersey and I think Utah is the most recent one. There's a couple of other states that are kind of playing with draft legislation. Do you guys have anything that you've got kind of written down?
That's a wish list for sure. I mean, we would love to that integrated into all schools. We've talked about it. The problem at least the feedback we've gotten is that since we don't currently have we don't have state dollars paying for this, putting that mandate or request into a bill without state funding to back it up is a challenge. So I think some other universities across the nation do have state funding that they are able to, but I'm not sure which, to be honest with you, but I would imagine that it would make it an easier transition if there were state funds attached.
Yeah, we actually had Collegiate Recovery and Recovery High Schools written into the original CARA, Comprehensive Addiction Recovery Act. And of course, CARA 2.0 just came out that you guys are familiar with. And again, this is the reason why Collegiate Recovery needs to unite to really push that advocacy, because we made it to one of the last stages in that bill, and we're cut. And we weren't even asking for that much money. I think it was like 10 million or something like that. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of potential to do some great work together if we could come up with an advocacy agenda.
I agree, and I think the more people learn about it, the more, so it's sort of a supply and demand thing. And again, those advocates, like me as a parent, so I have a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old, but when my child is ready to go to school, I want them to be at a school that has the option of having a collegiate recovery program, if for no other reason that I know there'll be social activities that aren't surrounded by drugs and alcohol, and I know how recovery hostile those environments are. So just looking at, why wouldn't everyone expect that? Why wouldn't everyone? Sort of like what Chris has an interesting. He's been doing this work for a lot of years, as you know, with NC State, trying to get NC State, which is a large university, to engage in collegiate recovery, and he's made grand efforts with that, and they are involved now. But what he talked about was going to a football game and there being a drunk tent, and there's a drunk tent, but there's not a safe place for people to, sit and engage with other who are in recovery and go watch a game and be with others who aren't drinking and using. And so it's a philosophical change in addition to a policy change. And I would say that a lot of times the advocacy has to take root for that to happen.
And really interesting is our state attorney general convened students from every public university in North Carolina to help combat the opioid crisis on college campuses. What the attorney general's office found out very quickly was that students were more really concerned about benzodiazepines and prescription stimulants as well. But what came out of this year-long council was a 9-page report by the Attorney General's office on recommendations for campuses that came from students, with a little bit of guidance here and there from professionals, but a 9-page document about recommendations for collegiate prevention, treatment, and recovery on campus. And we have a lot of really good ideas. Sometimes we have a lot of laws. We got to make sure that what we are doing have teeth in them. I know Maryland recently passed the state of Maryland passed a collegiate recovery mandate, but it didn't have any teeth in it. There was no way to enforce it. So if you do all the work, make sure there's some piece of it that is enforceable, or else we just end up with a bunch of, where we're lacking in parity across the nation as well. So make sure that the work you're doing will have teeth associated with it at the end.
That's a great point, Chris. Thank you. Yeah, I think New Jersey, when they passed their collegiate recovery bill, it was for housing, but there wasn't any attached funding to it. So they've gone back and they've worked on that, but the original bill didn't have any funding, unfortunately. Any other questions? We have about 5 minutes left. Or comments. Well, this is a really important conversation. It's a very heavy conversation, too. It's very complex. So I appreciate everybody hanging in there. I do have one final question for Chris and for Jessica in regards to if people wanted to try to approach their state about doing some kind of similar model, if you will, as what you guys are doing. So if you have a job description or anything you could share, Chris, as far as materials that folks may be able to to share with their state, with their SSAs?
Yeah, I very much have a scope of work, and what's been interesting about my scope of work and my job description is that it has been allowed to be very dynamic. So initially we were really focused on the 6 schools, and as we started to work within the universities and everything, we started to recognize a lot of areas where individuals would need other technical assistance, technical support. And so my area of focus really has now shifted from those 6 universities. I'm still very much working with them, but also working with the historically Black colleges and universities, as well as the community colleges, to sort of shed the same sort of spotlight on them that we are a massive 4-year, predominantly white institutions, that all the individuals who are in need of recovery supports. So I will always say this, is if there's a massive gap somewhere in your state, and you can step in and fill that gap, do that. I never believed it until it happened, but if you're passionate about your work, and you're willing to put it all on like credit cards for a couple of years, if the work is good, somebody will notice at some point.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate that, and I'm sure your credit card does too. but hopefully we'll get some really great materials generated. We need those outcome standards. We need these advocacy packets, marketing material, and so it sounds like we have a lot of work ahead of us. But I'm very excited and welcome anybody that would like to get into this conversation. I want to mention just quickly, Katie Bean in Philly from St. Joseph, she listed a really cool conference. I really wish I could go, in the chat box. It looks like they're doing a similar conference on this topic, actually. So the link is there on their site. We're going to have a much smaller event than what they're doing at St. Joseph's at the AREG conference. There's going to be an advocacy luncheon, and we have some pretty cool guests coming for that. So I hope everybody will be able to attend and grab some food, talk about recruitment for the advocacy army that we're trying to build. And then also, again, we welcome any ideas for future conversations for the webinars or any other discussion or anything like that. So with that, Sarah has one quick question. There's not registration for the advocacy luncheon at the conference, but there is registration for the actual overarching AREG conference. And I think we had that link. It's just at collegiaterecovery.org. You can go there to check out the conference information. So I'll send out an evaluation, and you guys have a wonderful week. We really appreciate you joining us again, and good luck with graduations and the end of your semester. I know this is stressful, but we really appreciate you being a part of our community. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the work that you do,
Thanks,
everyone.
Kristen.
Thank you, Kristen.
Thanks, guys.